of the People for Active Democracy. It's great to see you all here, and I would like Shashi Tharoor, to acknowledge my dear friends from across the border. We have a genuine rock star in our midst, Salman Ahmed of Junoon, and his lovely wife Samina, and my very good friend Rahul Bose, who happened to be here from Mumbai, from Bollywood, is also listening to us. So it's good to see the widespread interest in the kinds of issues that we're talking about this evening, and I'm very, very pleased, of course, that my most severe critic, my wife Sunanda, is sitting right there to tear me apart when we finish. But I just want to add to how delighted I am to see all of you here, because clearly the average age of this audience is considerably lower than the average age of our political class, of our parliament or our cabinet. And I want to congratulate you all for having taken the trouble and the interest to come here and think about these issues. I've often observed the fact that ours is a country where 65% of the population is under 35. The median age is 28. And I believe the median age of our government is about 65. So we have a challenge in making you all feel that we're relevant to what you do. And it's just delightful to see that you at least think that what we have to say is relevant to you here today. Now, the topic that has been announced is the efficacy of the parliamentary system of government. So I won't go into all the wonderfully interesting ground that Shashi Tharoor covered, because I think I'm going to focus specifically on what the discussion today is all about. And I would start off by saying that what's wrong with the parliamentary system of government is that it is built on the unusual perversion, unusual except in Britain and those countries ruled by it at one time, that you elect the legislature in order to form the executive. Now, objectively, that makes very little sense at all, because the legislature's job is to represent the people and to form laws on behalf of the people that are imposed upon the people. The executive's job ought to be to run the government and deliver results for the people. But because we do this, we have a situation in which we are constantly electing legislators who are not particularly qualified to legislate, who are not particularly interested in the processes of legislation, but who contest for the legislature because they have an ambition to form the executive. That is, they run to be MP, not to write laws, but to become ministers or at least form the government of their party. And the further complication of this logic of the parliamentary system is that, of course, you need a parliamentary majority to rule. And in a country like ours, where there are so many different voices, so many different interests, such diversity that we reflect in our political system, we have not had any party having a majority since Rajiv Gandhi lost his in 1989. And thereafter, without a one-party majority in our parliaments, we've been condemned to either minority government support surviving on outside support, or coalition governments, which of course mean that the process of managing your coalition, sustaining your majority in order to stay in power, has become far more important than what you actually do for the people with your power. So the difficulty we have is that we have created through the parliamentary system a system in which the emphasis is on politics and not policy, on political interests and not on performance, because it is far more important to sustain your majority, keep it going so your government doesn't fall, than in actually delivering results, because the results no longer depend on the voters who, after all, will have to wait for their turn to pronounce themselves. Your survival depends on what the other parties in your coalition consider to be interesting and necessary for them. Now, this is the fundamental flaw, it seems to me, in the system we've inherited. It may have worked very well in a tiny little island off the coast of Europe, where each constituency is very small, where you had coherently organized class interests that constituted these parties, where the parliamentary system emerged from a certain logic in the political evolution of that country. But to transplant it to a $1.2 billion people nation, with the kind of diversities and variety we have, the levels of education, the different kinds of identity formation, as Rudy mentioned, where elements of caste, of creed, of religion, of region, of language, all of these come into the political makeup. That transplantation has not worked at all. And the result is that we now put our voters in the invidious position that they may know which individual they want to actually elect to rule them, but to get that individual into a position of power, they have to vote for a party. So very often, as again Rudy very clearly mentioned, what we've seen in UP is you didn't vote Samajwadi Party because you liked the candidate of the Samajwadi Party in your area. You voted for Samajwadi Party if you wanted to see Mulayam Singh Yadav or his son running the government. Similarly, you voted for the BSP not because of the merits of a local candidate, but if you wanted Mayawati to come back to power. And this sort of logic has been there throughout. In 1971, in the 1971 elections, I still remember that many Congress candidates had not their own pictures on their election posters, but the pictures of Indira Gandhi, because it was an election about vindicating Indira Gandhi and bringing her to power. In Andhra Pradesh, hardly anybody knew who the candidates of the Telugu Desam Party were. They voted for N.T. Rama Rao, the great film hero, who'd come and entered the political arena in order to deliver the Telugu people from the kind of governments they had been subjected to before. That sort of logic. So, in other words, you're voting for individuals. That has been very much the mindset of the Indian voter for quite some time now. And it's a natural thing. It in fact demands less sophistication on the part of the voter to expect him or her to choose an individual. Because the coherent set of party policies that the British are so enamored of, frankly, doesn't exist in our country. You have parties that are not coherent ideologically. Pretty much every political party, with the possible exception of the one that Chandan and Rudy belong to, is a variant in one form or the other of the Nehruvian socialism that the Congress Party as a national movement launched on this country in the late 40s, early 50s. And there is really no significant ideological difference that divides these parties. What divides them is caste interests, regional interests, and above all, individual leadership. And therefore, what do we find? We've given, as I said, we've got the wrong kind of legislators, and they've been chosen by voters who've been given the wrong kind of choice. Then you've got, of course, what you do when you've had this election formed. You've got to be a member of parliament to actually be in the government. So we increasingly have a government of people who are electable, but not necessarily able. Of course, you can, to some degree, put some able people in the Rajya Sabha and appoint them to government. But since the Rajya Sabha is by and large, with honourable exceptions like Chandan, consisting, and Rudy, consisting largely of, I beg your pardon, not Rudy, of Chandan, the Rajya Sabha consists, No, I'm saying, let me finish my thought. The Rajya Sabha, with a few honourable exceptions like Chandan, is still largely the province of politicians. So Rudy is not exempt. Ultimately, you're still drawing from the same talent pool that you would have drawn from. There are very, very few additional talents, with a handful of exceptions. Narasimha Rao's appointment of Manmohan Singh is a very famous example in 1991. It was also a government that appointed Professor M.G.K. Menon to be Minister of Science and Technology. A couple of such rare exceptions. Otherwise, you're forming your government from the electable and not necessarily from the talents you need to actually run a government in a country of this size. So that's the third major problem. The fourth major aspect of parliamentary efficacy or efficiency, as we've seen it in practice, is the functioning of our wonderful parliament. I'm a member of parliament now for just 3 years, and I've actually sat and listened with avid interest when we were given our orientation briefing as new MPs. And we were all told the do's and don'ts, and amongst the don'ts were, do not stand up or speak out of turn, do not turn your back on the speaker, do not wave placards, do not shout slogans, do not walk into the well of the house without permission, submit a slip to the table, that's all. And every single one of these I found violated within a few days of my sitting in Parliament. In fact, what is striking about the way in which our Parliament functions is precisely that the logic of the parliamentary system has defeated the parliamentarians. They feel once you've been elected, the majority is unknown. As Rudy pointed out, there's an anti-defection law, so you can't vote against the whip of your party, right? Which means that the outcome of almost every vote is predictable. Of course, in a coalition government, if there is a dissatisfied coalition partner, there may be a risk that that coalition partner doesn't vote with you, or an outside supporting party doesn't vote with you. That can still give you drama. But within each party, you have to vote as the party instructs you to, or the anti-defection law kicks in, and the person is expelled from the party and thereby from Parliament. So what happens? The outcome is a foregone conclusion. And since the outcome is a foregone conclusion, many parliamentarians, particularly in the opposition parties and the smaller parties in general, will tend to say it's far more interesting to convey to the public on television the passion with which we believe something or care about a particular issue by disrupting the lawmaking rather than by debating the law. Because if you debate the law, you know you're going to lose the vote at the end of it anyway. You don't have the numbers. So disrupt the lawmaking, shout, because it's certainly 50 people shouting is enough to drown out the remaining 400. And indeed, as we've seen, the speaker frequently is reduced to saying, "Baith jaiye, shant ho jaiye." And then, जब लोग बैठ नहीं जाते हैं, शांत नहीं हो जाते हैं, तो of course she has to adjourn the house. And that has happened with dismaying frequency. There was one session in 2010 when the friends from Modi's and Chandan's party essentially disrupted the entire session. Not 1 minute of business could be transacted. So the challenge we have, therefore, is that Parliament very rarely functions as a senior, serious debating chamber for ideas, for the discussion of policies, for negotiations of laws. Indeed, as Rudy said, the bureaucrats write the laws. For the most part, there are laws passed, but sometimes with less than 5 minutes of debate in Parliament, particularly when shouting is going on. I've actually once found myself voting for a bill with 50 people standing in the well and shouting, and the speaker, and you can only hear it through the headphones, saying, those in favor say aye, and we all say aye. It's another British relic like the parliamentary system itself. Why can't we say yes or how? But no, we say aye. But that's the way that's working right now. Then we've got what? We've got fundamentally a system that obliges those in power to cater to the lowest common denominator. Coalition politics has its own logic. We've heard of the expression coalition dharma. Coalition dharma means you either humor the slightest wish of your allies, or you be prepared to give up power, give up government, and because there is no alternative formulation, the country has to be subjected to yet another election. So you have to ask yourself, how much are you prepared to sacrifice in order to fulfill your larger objectives in politics? And so whether it is the withdrawal of FDI, which was announced as a policy that doesn't actually need legislative approval, whether it was the Indo-US nuclear deal, whether it was the price hike in the railway budget, all it takes is a party supporting you or a party in your own coalition to say they don't like it, and the government is frequently obliged to cave. Now the problem is that ours is a country where this kind of governance, a governance that inevitably, for all the reasons I've explained to you, focuses more on politics than on performance, ours is a country that we can't afford this kind of governance. We need action. We need decisive action. We need leadership that actually is able to take the responsibility for its choices and be accountable after a reasonable period of time. This is why, for me, the cynicism that Rudy referred to in his remarks, the cynicism that so many people across our country feel about the entire political class, about the process of politics, can be attributed directly not to our democracy but to the workings of our parliamentary system. I'm totally convinced that democracy is the only way forward for our country. It's the only way we can actually manage our diversity, because our democracy says that you can transcend differences of caste, of creed, of color, of culture, of cuisine, of conviction, of custom and costume, and still rally around a consensus. Because that consensus in our country is that in a rich and diverse democracy like India, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. That is what has sustained our democracy. It's made us work effectively. But those ground rules don't have to be the ground rules the British gave us. You know, Clement Attlee, the former British Prime Minister, came down with I think it was the Simon Commission or possibly the Cripps one. No, the Simon Commission. And he came down and reported that when he discussed the suitability of a presidential system for India, the Indian nationalist leaders reacted with horror. He wrote, they acted as if I was offering them margarine instead of butter. Now that was the problem, because we, like the Americans 200 years earlier, were fighting for the rights of Englishmen. We wanted to have the rights to run ourselves the way the British were running themselves. So we thought their system was the one we had to adopt. And it was quite amazing how proud we were of having borrowed all their traditions and their practices in Parliament. All the British rules of order and precedent came down to us. Even this business of saying aye. We don't applaud when we like something, we thump our desks. That's another British relic. In fact, there was an Anglophile communist MP called Hiren Mukherjee, who wrote very proudly in the late 50s of how when the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden came down to India and sat and watched the Indian Parliament at work, that he found it more authentic than his own Parliament. This was for the Indian MP. This is a great accomplishment. Now, this is the sort of tradition that we are trying. But naturally, the robust disorderliness of the Indian people has reasserted itself, and we are no longer the Parliament of Hiren Mukherjee's admiration. We are the Parliament that is disrupted frequently, that is simply not permitting our government to take decisive action. So what's the answer? The answer to me lies in a directly elected chief executive at the center, at the states, and at all local levels. The fact is that Manish has already pointed out to us the basic structure doctrine. I actually don't think that is such a problem. He's a lawyer and I'm not, so he might correct me. But it seems to me that it's very easy, if parliamentary democracy is part of the basic structure of the Constitution, we will have to go for a hybrid formula where you keep the Parliament, you keep everything in the Constitution, but you strike out one sentence in the Constitution which says the President shall abide by the advice of the Council of Ministers. If that is struck out, everything else in the Constitution is done in the name of the President. So the President will actually exercise the power that today she only has in theory. If you look at the Constitution, it is a presidential Constitution, but the President shall abide by the advice of the Council of Ministers. Just take that out and you have a hybrid formula, basic structure, it seems to me, would not be affected. What are the other objections to a presidential system? One is, of course, the classic argument that was used 2 or 3 times already when this debate has come up in our country, and that is the fear of dictatorship. To me, the first and obvious answer is that the fear of dictatorship is misplaced because a directly elected president in Delhi will be balanced by directly elected chief ministers, or you can call them governors if you want, in each of our 28 states and the union territories, and they in turn will be balanced by directly elected people down the level. I'd like to see a directly elected Zilla Parishad head. I'd like to see a directly elected Panchayat head. Look at our mayors. I mean, our mayors are unable to do anything useful because they're little more than glorified chairmen of municipal committees. You go to China, if you're a businessman wanting to invest in China, you go there, you talk to the mayor, and once the mayor has said yes, he has the authority to give you everything you want. Your land, your water, your electricity, your roads, your tax holidays. Everything is delivered by one executive at the city level, at the town level. In our country, even if a mayor says yes, everything he says will have to be second-guessed by 7 other institutions, by his own bureaucracy, by different departments, and finally by the state government as well. So the mayor essentially chairs and presides over a municipal corporation council, but does very little else. So if you want effective results, elect somebody at each of these levels. Give them a finite term of office. Let's say the same 5 years we now give our Lok Sabha. And during those 5 years, expect them to deliver results untroubled by a parliamentary majority. So it doesn't matter. There will be no vote of confidence or no confidence. Once the people have given you their confidence, for 5 years you stay in power and you do your work. At the end of 5 years, you become accountable to the voters. You can't blame a coalition partner or coalition dharma. You can't blame an ally. You can't blame parliamentary inefficiency. All you can do is say, this is what I could do as the president or the mayor or the governor or whatever you decide to hold to account. Yes, one answer has been given to me already when I wrote to this. Some of you may have seen my article in Tehelka magazine about the case for a presidential system. And one of the answers that was raised by an MP who is not here today in a discussion on television was, well, look at the Americans. They have a presidential system and they're completely paralyzed in Congress these days. But that's the Americans. They have a 2-party system. It's almost impossible for any other voice to get elected. Very, very rare to have one independent in the Senate or the Congress. In India, we have 44 political parties recognized by the Election Commission. We have 932 unrecognized but listed in the Election Commission website. We have such a plethora, from the Adarsh Lokdal to the Womanist Party of India. I don't know if you even knew there was a Womanist Party of India, but we have all of this. 13 communist parties. Now, in a country like this, there will always be so many discordant voices that governance will change in a presidential system. Yes, you will have to have Parliament passing laws and passing budgets, but it will be impossible to have the kind of American problem where we have a president from one party and a parliament from the other party, because there will be not just an other party, there will be dozens of other parties, and a creative president can essentially govern the country by shifting coalitions of parties on different issues. In other words, you assemble a majority for each issue you want to pass, for each thing you want to pass. That would be the creativity of the President's parliamentary managers. But the Parliament would very rarely find itself completely paralyzed by a monolithic opposition, because such a thing would not exist in our country. Another objection that's been given is that our parliamentary system truly reflects all the voices in our country. A president would simply be elected by a brute majority. But my counter argument is a president would have to appeal to all. Right now, you can be elected on the basis of a narrow caste appeal in one constituency, in one state, and through the process of parliamentary decision-making selection, you can become Prime Minister of all of India, without ever having had to think about the problems of people in states unlike yours, who don't speak the language you speak, who have other kinds of issues to think about. A president would not have that luxury. In my view, a president would be forced to actually be far more national in outlook. And the danger that, was it Rudy or Manish who mentioned, of regional parties taking over the ownership of this country would actually be reduced in a presidential system, because a national vision would be necessary. And I would immediately understand the next objection that is going to come. But our Hindi walas, maaf kijiye mujhe, our Hindi walas have not been able to follow the population control that the people south of the Vindhyas have done, so their population has become so large, they will win every presidential election. How will we ever actually have a fair shake for the rest of the country? It's actually not an unreasonable argument. The government and many governments have been conscious of this, which is why the delimitation of Lok Sabha constituencies is frozen at the census of 1971, because they didn't want to reward the states who had failed to control their populations effectively. But having said that, 7 of our first 11 prime ministers were from UP. So maybe 7 of our next 11 presidents will be from UP. It doesn't matter, as long as that person has been obliged to reach out to the rest of the country. And we would ensure that by borrowing from the Americans the idea of an electoral college, insisting that a president would have to win states in other parts than his own, other parts of the country than his or her own. And also, of course, we would need to follow the French system of 2 rounds of elections, because in a country like ours with so many varieties of voices, you never have just a 2-candidate election like in America. The first round may have 40 candidates, with only the top 2 emerging, who would then come up and deal with it. Then people say, but what about minorities? Would somebody from Manipur ever get elected? Would a Muslim candidate ever become president? Would we really be able to have a Manmohan Singh, who represents a community that's only 2% of our country's population? And the answer is, I believe, yes. Why would we think that the Indian voter is any less liberal or enlightened than voters in other countries which have acted this way? The people of Jamaica, 97% black or colored, voted a white man as their leader, Edward Seaga. The people of Kenya took Daniel Arap Moi, who represented a tribe of only 11% of the population. And there are much larger tribes, the Kikuyu and so on, the Maasai. But this man was elected president not once but 3 times. You have example after example in Latin America, where a country like Argentina, which is almost racist in its pride of its European origins, voted twice for the son of Syrian immigrants, Carlos Saul Menem. Or in Peru, a similarly white-dominated Latin American country, where Alberto Fujimori, a Japanese, and the Japanese are less than 1% of the Peruvian population, was elected president. So why should Indian voters be any less able to see in their imagination? If a Jayaprada from Andhra Pradesh can be elected in UP, I don't see why a credible Manipuri or a South Indian or a person from Kashmir who happens to be Muslim or whatever could not attract, with the right kind of appeal to the voters, could not attract a majority. So in other words, all the objections that I've heard, to me, don't hold water. And I would argue that the final objection, which is the objection that our parliamentary system makes people far more accountable, is also not accurate, because to my mind, yes, accountability is a great virtue of a parliamentary system, as opposed to the decisive decision-making that comes in a presidential system. But in the kind of hybrid I'm talking about that fits in within our constitution, you would have an independent parliament that does not form the executive, that does not make or break the executive, but does hold the the government to account, as the American parliament does, the Congress does, by being able to have truly strong committees, by being able to have independent legislators who are not tied down to a party whip, because the government, in fact, does not fall because of the person's views, so they can truly hold the government accountable. if today I were to disagree with some policy of my government, I could not effectively express that disagreement because it would attract penalties under the anti-defection law. Tomorrow a parliamentarian in the kind of system I'm advocating would be able to do so, and he would not be limited by the whips that we have in our system that tell him how he can vote and what he can say. So the bottom line is, I would love to have had the time to give my own version of the various tragedies still prevailing in our country that Rudy described so eloquently. But as he said, there are so many challenges in our nation, and he described some of them, for which the only solution can be delivering results to the people. And this, to my mind, transcends parties. I don't care whether it was the BJP who came up with the idea or whether the emergency that I opposed personally was the first time the idea was floated. For me, the logic is ultimately in terms of results for the Indian people. They deserve better than the kind of system we have inflicted on them over these years. And it seems to me if we can actually get a serious consensus in our country going, the presidential system, we can open what is very much a closed debate. I share Rudy's pessimism when he said that he'll never see this in his lifetime. I think that's probably true because everyone in the political class, or a majority of the political class, would have to agree to bring about this change. And a majority of the political class would much rather function in the system they know, and they know how to manipulate and they know how to work. So it may not be easy to get about this change, but it's worth putting it out there to intelligent, young, conscious, politically minded people like you, so that you can take these ideas out into our society. I suspect that the way our politics is going, the demand for change is going to grow, and this, to my mind, would be the most effective way of bringing about a change that can also change your lives. Thank you very much.